Hello and welcome to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast, a podcast all about constructing your career in neurology. I'm your host, Catherine Fu, and I'm currently a Movement Disorders Fellow at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. Today, as part of a podcast on imposter syndrome, we're going to be talking with Dr. Karima Benamer, Associate Professor in Neurology and Neurohospitalist at Emory University, and Dr. Vanessa Cooper, Assistant Professor of Neurology and Headache Specialist at Yale University, and Associate Director of Diversity and Inclusion Education. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us, Dr. Benamer and Dr. Cooper. So before we begin, I want to provide a bit of a disclaimer and say that imposter syndrome or the imposter phenomenon is a big topic and a subject of extensive social and organizational psychology research, actually, which is beyond the scope of today's podcast. I also want to acknowledge that there has been quite a bit of buzz on social media and even the use of the term imposter syndrome and proposals to shift to other language. And once again, I do want to acknowledge the complexity of this topic. I think the main theme is that there's certainly a push to shift the onus of imposter syndrome off of solely the individual and to consider the other societal, organizational, and contextual elements that contribute to these feelings. I hope that in today's podcast, we will be discussing strategies at multiple levels to address imposter syndrome. So with that said, Dr. Benamer, I will have you start with the question, what is imposter syndrome?
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, Catherine. So, like you said, imposter phenomenon. I like to call it phenomenon better because syndrome has kind of a medical connotation. And even though it is associated with depression and anxiety, it's actually not part of the DSM or even in the ICD. The imposter phenomenon is this, if you look in the dictionary, it's this persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. So this is actually the definition that's in the Oxford Dictionary. What it is that it's a very real and specific form of basically intellectual self-doubt. No matter what you achieve, you still feel this persistent inability to believe that all your achievements were the result of your hard work and that they were deserved. So historically, the imposter phenomenon actually was introduced in 1978, so really not that long ago. And it was introduced by two psychologists who at the time were at Georgia State, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they had a paper they published a paper at the time that was called The Imposter Phenomenon in High Achieving Women, Dynamics and Therapeutic Intervention. So they were psychologists, like I said, at Georgia State, and they just noticed that a lot of their women students and faculty had a lot of self-doubt, and they decided to study the phenomenon. So they surveyed over 100 women at the time, and all of the participants had been recruited either because they were their students or they had known them. All the participants had formally been recognized for their professional excellence, either by their academic achievement or by colleagues. So some of them were also faculty. And so these women, despite the consistent external validation that they had received, they lacked this internal acknowledgement of their accomplishments. And, a lot of times when you ask people who have imposter syndrome what they think is responsible for their success, they'll say, I think it was luck. And so that's where the initial imposter phenomenon word came from and where the research started. And what they found in that first study was that it was really related to first gender stereotypes, so much more in women, but also associated with familial problems, cultural norms. And in that study, they found that women who suffered from the imposter phenomenon also suffered from generalized anxiety, lack of self-confidence, depression. So that's kind of a little bit of, a historical background to it.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much for that historical background and for that context. If either of you don't mind sharing, when would you say that your imposter syndrome perhaps was previously a bit more severe, or do you mind giving examples of when you maybe have experienced that imposter phenomenon yourself?
Yes, I can go ahead. So I would say I felt personally my imposter phenomenon was most severe when I made the transition from medical school into residency. just because, I had the self-doubt whether I would be able to live up to what was already set forth by the residency program. Am I a good doctor? How did I get into this? How did I get into your residency program? Was this a mistake? So I had a lot of self-doubt, and it did require a lot of, I would say, positive daily affirmations from close relatives that really helped me to kind of get over that feeling initially, also in part by positive feedback I was getting from the residency director and colleagues and peers, which we were able to see after each rotation, definitely helped with that feeling that, okay, maybe I do belong here. Maybe it's not by chance. So I would say, those were some strategies that helped me, and that's when I felt it most severe.
I had a little bit of the same. So I'm a foreign medical graduate. I went to medical school in my home country of Algeria. And, then I came to the US for residency and further training. And, so we do medical school in Algeria in French. And so essentially when I was studying for the USMLEs to be able to actually apply for residency here, I essentially had to retool my entire medicine, because it was in English and it was a different way of studying, of thinking, in medicine. And so I actually worked really, really hard on those USMLE scores and, had really good scores. I knew that as a foreign graduate, you had to be better than the average American graduate for programs to actually take a chance in, taking you on. But I had really good scores. But then that first week of internship, when I started residency, oh gosh, it was, severe imposter phenomenon. They're going to figure out that my scores were just because I'm good at test taking. And what if I'm not a good doctor? And that had, I think that it had something to do with the fact that I came from, a developing country to the US, the mecca of healthcare research and medicine. And so, you feel little. So that got a lot better as I started going through training, and I saw that, I was not dumber than my co-residents. But then I had it again at one point as a faculty, actually, when I started getting interested in nutrition and brain health. So that's my area of interest. And I'm kind of an odd bird of being a neurologist who has an interest in nutrition. And as I started getting interested in that, that's not something that I've had much training in. And so a lot of the work that I've done on it, or even the talks that I have given on it, I've had some serious imposter phenomenon.
Yeah, Dr. Benamra, thank you so much for sharing. To follow up on sort of those experiences, what behaviors did you implement or strategies did you use to try to combat that imposter phenomenon?
So for me, it was honestly, it was the positive feedback of just doing my daily work and seeing that I was not any worse than everybody else who was in training, when I was a resident, that we were all there to learn. Nobody was expected to know it all. It was really just, reading on every patient that I saw and just really, a lot of it is actually the self-talk, right? And dealing with your inner thoughts, encountering that negative self-talk. And as, you go through life and you see more and more evidence for, your work, that you can use that essentially as tangible evidence that you are not any worse than everybody else who is on this journey. So for me, that's what it was. It was a lot of using the evidence that I saw for my work and recognizing that it was a lot of my inner thoughts that I had to work on.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I will say that, yes, I've also had sort of similar experiences with imposter phenomenon. And perhaps one example, which sort of manifests in even day-to-day life, is like whenever I participate in meetings and we have an hour and there's, 10 other people at this meeting, I initially had this pretty big hesitancy of speaking up because I felt like my contributions were either not worthwhile or we only had an hour. And so was this specific, sentence that I had to say like worth the 5 minutes or 2 minutes of that hour? But then what I started realizing was that either one, someone else later on would make the same point that I wanted to make, Or that too, if I didn't ask the question or make the point that, we leave the meeting and I would be like, oh, I'm not sure how to proceed with this project. And I wish I would have clarified earlier on. And so I think recognizing these things as I moved forward was important. But I wanted to ask you, Dr. Cooper, do you have any other examples of how imposter phenomenon maybe manifests in day-to-day life and how you've managed those examples?
Oh, yes. So kind of piggybacking off of what you just said. So I think it was alluded to before that I think imposter phenomenon definitely affects women more than males, and also racial and gender minorities as well. So, for example, in these meetings where it's maybe a room full of Caucasian males, manifestation of imposter phenomenon could be, like you said, not speaking up in meetings, not asking questions because you don't want to say the wrong thing. You kind of have this overwhelming feeling, maybe of perfectionism. So you have to know everything. You have really high standards for yourself. And I think for me, this usually leads to a hesitancy to speaking up when I'm in a room full of people that I'm maybe intimidated by. And because of this can also lead to passing up opportunities for promotion or seeking out new opportunities, just because you may be scared of failure or you may feel personally that you're incapable of achieving such things. And I think this also manifests that women may also tend to minimize salary expectations. So I think that's a really great example. I know there's been a few studies like, men, they're not scared to ask for what they think they deserve. And I feel women feel the need to kind of lower what they are expecting as far as salaries go. And then it becomes really important to renegotiate our contracts, which I feel like I went to a workshop recently and they were talking about women are less likely to renegotiate their contracts and ask for a bigger salary or ask for more time because of this imposter phenomenon.
Yes, great points. Certainly the gender wage gap is something that is well recognized. Dr. Benamor, would you mind sharing perhaps some either resources or mentorship that you had sought previously to perhaps help you once again sort of combat this phenomenon, or any recommendations for how people should seek resources or mentorship?
Yeah, so I think there are two things. I think that there are things that you can do at an individual level, but there are also some things that need to be at the departmental level or at the institutional level. And I'll go a little bit into why that is. So as far as individual level, like I said, it's a lot of realizing that your thoughts make your feelings, as the old Stoic philosophy would say. So you really have to essentially kind of try to focus on what's going on to help you overcome your negative self-talk. And sometimes it can be helpful to actually make a list of things that you are good at or things that have gone well that day. For example, at the end of the day, go through your day in your mind and write down a list of things that went well, things that you were really good at. And that would be essentially you helping yourself, looking for data to show your mind and your brain that you are not, the imposter that your thoughts are making you believe you are. Another thing that is actually really helpful is just being a teacher to other people around you. So, if you are faculty, being a teacher to younger faculty and, to residents and fellows. Because when you find opportunities to train and mentor others, that also is going to show you, it kind of brings to the surface your strengths and your skills, which in turn will help you overcome that negative self-talk. And then finding a mentor, it's really important to find a mentor and, just kind of let them know, I'm really struggling with this imposter phenomenon, or I feel like a fraud, or, and you can say that to your mentor or to your peers even. It doesn't really have to be a mentor, because the good news, I don't know if it's good news, but, the data shows that about 70% of people will have experienced imposter phenomenon at one point. So there's a very high likelihood that if and when you confide in somebody, they will say, oh, me too, that kind of thing. And so it kind of normalizes things. Also knowing that, for example, if you are a mentor to somebody, not only showing them the data that a lot of people suffer from this, but even people who are very accomplished, like the tennis icon Serena Williams shared that she had suffered from imposter phenomenon. Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg, Michelle Obama, very respected actors in Hollywood like Tom Hanks, Tina Fey. And actually, imposter phenomenon has a tendency to happen in people who are very well accomplished. It does not happen in people who are not as accomplished, if anything. As a mentor, I would say if you are mentoring somebody who has imposter phenomenon, just continuously challenge that negative self-talk that they have, right? So show them, for example, feedback from students that they have received or from residents, or just essentially look for data to counteract that negative self-talk.
Yeah, I think those are all great things on the individual level, which is awesome. And I just wanted to add, from an organizational level, there are certain things that the organization can also do to help to combat the imposter phenomenon. For example, the organization could be proactive in setting norms, such as recognizing women for excellent work, making sure that they aim for health, like equitable pay between genders, as well as minorities, and then allocating resources for leadership training for women minorities as well. I think from organizational level, this can help with those feelings of the imposter phenomenon. And also when you do recruit people who look like you and able to become a mentor at a leadership level, I think for me, it lessens the feeling of imposter syndrome. I'm like, oh, okay, they come from a similar background. They're able to do such things. They're sitting at the table. And I feel like, I feel more comfortable. I can possibly do that too. So definitely improving diversity, whether it's gender, race, et cetera, in senior positions, I feel is also important behaviors and resources to help combat imposter phenomenon.
I completely agree with Dr. Cooper. And, if anything, actually, there's data in the psychology literature. As Dr. Cooper had mentioned earlier, imposter phenomenon has a tendency to affect women more and has a tendency to affect minorities more. And the reason that it affects these groups of people more is because there have been institutional ways of marginalizing these groups of people in the past, right? Minorities have been marginalized, women were marginalized. And so it really is important to, when you're mentoring somebody, to put the focus on the institutions that have let this develop or even helped this develop. And that it's not your fault that you're feeling like a fraud. It's because for the longest time, women were thought to be inferior to men, or, people of African American descent were thought to be inferior to other, that kind of thing. And to kind of put the onus on the institutionalized ways that this has developed. And so the institutions do have to come up with ways of combating this.
Yeah, these are all great points. I think at this point, I'll just summarize briefly. So we've talked about strategies to combat imposter phenomenon at sort of the individual level. So once again, thinking of ways to confront that negative self-talk, recognizing your own achievements, acknowledging those achievements and successes, even more concretely, like writing a list, making notes to yourself and positive affirmations. We've also talked about ways to combat imposter phenomenon on sort of a community mentorship level. I think Dr. Benamer's point earlier in terms of those mentor-mentee relationships, even just acknowledging that imposter phenomenon is an issue is, I think, a big step forward. I don't think in any of my mentor-mentee conversations that I've had that this has been explicitly brought up, but I could see how that could be extremely helpful to even, have that label and then be able to move forward with how we can confront these issues and how we can strategize to mitigate its effect on career development. And then also on an organizational level, for example, having tailored faculty development, leadership training geared towards women or minorities, underrepresented minorities in medicine. These are all fantastic suggestions. Dr. Benamer, do you have anything else to add on what could be done on a departmental or institutional level to help address this issue?
I think Dr. Cooper, did a great job at summarizing that. I would say there are workshops that have been developed, that have been done at certain institutions, and that actually have been published. So, there are resources out there that are evidence-based that departments can use to help their faculty. I would also say that, that's for the medical world. And I would say that, imposter phenomenon is not something that is, particular to the medical world. And so even hiring consulting companies to mentor faculty in this regard, there are many institutions that have a faculty assistance program. And I think that making sure that imposter phenomenon is part of the things that are covered is probably very helpful. I think those would be good ways of starting the conversation.
Great. Yeah. I recently attended the ACGME conference this year, which was virtual, but one of the posters that was presented was an educational curriculum geared towards helping residents combat the imposter phenomenon. And when I chatted with the authors of this poster, they actually said that this was something that the residents had proactively cited as a need and had wanted, and that was how this curriculum was developed. So I agree, things like educational curriculum, workshops, hiring consulting groups, these are all great strategies. And then I certainly want to pose this question to both of you, but I'll perhaps start with Dr. Cooper. What would you say to any of our listeners who may be suffering from imposter phenomenon? What advice do you have for them? I know we've talked about a variety of strategies, but want to close with this open-ended question.
So I think, if you're combating this syndrome, I think it's also very hard in this day and age, right? Like we have so much information. There's a lot of things on social media where things are made to look perfect all the time. And it's impossible to be perfect all the time. So living up to these expectations, whether at work and personal life, is exhausting. So I would say to take a step back, celebrate your wins, give yourself credit when you have worked hard. Kind of what was spoken to about before, make a routine of daily affirmations, write something down, bring out the positives into the picture every single day. Sometimes it's maybe helpful to even look back at positive thank you notes that you may have received from patients or families, positive feedback you may have received from your peers or your residency director. And those are things you can look back on when you're having these feelings to kind of help get you through it. And then also, I just want to make sure that people know that having these feelings are normal. But when you don't feel like you deserve an opportunity or position, when you don't advocate for yourself and push for the things that you truly deserve, that becomes worrisome. So I encourage you to talk to someone that you trust, have a small circle, a group of friends, whether inside of medicine, outside of medicine, that you can trust to give you honest feedback. And then find a group of supportive peers at work and at your program and mentors to help encourage you. And just to kind of help put things in perspective. And I think it's also important to note that imposter phenomena will come and go throughout your lifetime. It's not a one and done type thing. I feel like all major accomplishments and moving forward, it may pop up again, but having these tools and looking back will help you get through it.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ben-Amer, did you have anything to add?
I agree with everything Dr. Cooper has said. I think I would just want to I really want to stress the point that women and minorities being affected by the imposter phenomenon is a result of institutional classism, bias, racism. All of that is what's behind the fact that women and minorities are more affected by this. And so I think it's really important that women and minorities who are affected by this know that it's not their fault, that they are suffering from the result of institutional discrimination. And just telling people, you need to do some yoga, I think is putting the onus on them when they are victims of institutional discrimination. And so, of course, there are things that you can do at an individual level to kind of combat your self-talk. But really, the heavy lifting really needs to be done by institutions.
Right. Great. These are great points. I just want to add, to provide a little bit of context about my next point. So I'm hoping to pursue a career in medical education. And right now, there's a lot of conversation about sort of equity and education and grading. And some of the keys for achieving equity is setting clear expectations, giving regular formative feedback and evaluating people and students on competency-based metrics. And I think drawing the parallels between this strategy and sort of faculty development, it's very similar, right? You want to ask leadership for transparency, for those clear expectations, for clear metrics for promotion, for regular feedback and regular mentorship sessions, asking about how you can improve and what are the metrics by which you're being measured. And I can understand how sometimes when you're having those conversations with leadership, especially if there are very few other people in your department who look like you, it can be very hard to have those conversations. And I think that goes back to Dr. Cooper's point of having a strong community, having allies, and having mentors to really support you.
I think just to piggyback, of course, addressing the institutionalized component of it. And I feel pretty strongly about addressing institutionalized microaggressions, especially at the organizational level, because I feel like it's like an external component to feed into your imposter phenomenon, right? And so, yeah, so it's like, oh my goodness, people are going to find out I'm not qualified. And you have this inner feeling that you do not deserve what you have because of other people's microaggressions. So you add another layer to it. So definitely addressing that, whether I do think that institutions should have, microaggression training, because you need to, if you don't recognize it, you're not going to be able to change your behavior. And having not just like a one and done, but it should be something that happens continually, and it should be a culture at the institutional level. And this should also help with those marginalized communities.
Great. These have all been fantastic points. Well, thank you both so much for serving as our guest speakers on this podcast today. I think we've covered a lot of ground, from, once again, individual strategies to combat imposter phenomenon, to strategies that you can engage your mentors and mentees with, as well as strategies from a departmental and organizational level to try to address these issues. And I hope this conversation has really sparked this conversation, and that you can take things away from this podcast that then hopefully you can bring into your life, into your regular conversations, and to your, department or organization's leadership, to encourage them to find ways, whether it be workshops or curriculum or faculty development, to really try to mitigate the effects of these issues. So thank you both very much once again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
The Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast was created and produced by Sarah Schaefer. It is not recorded as an official podcast of any institution or organization. The podcast is unfunded. Opinions are those of the individual participants. Music by Audrey Nath, artwork by Shivani Ghoshal. Want more content like this? Be sure to subscribe to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast on whichever platform you use to listen to your podcasts to hear more about constructing your career in neurology. Follow us on Twitter at NeuroBolts and on Facebook at Neurology Nuts and Bolts to stay up to date on new content, and give us feedback on what you want to hear, and share episodes with your friends and colleagues. Thanks for listening, and tune in for the next episode.